Good evening. This is your barkeeper speaking. Glad you could join us for tonight's show. Think you're gonna like it. And don't forget to lock that door on your way out.
Booger Valley, Part 3. So with that, Papa and the sheriff decided it was not a good idea to go in the woods that night. Instead, the sheriff decided to station patrolmen up and down the road and told them to call him if anything had happened. Well, it didn't take long for it to get dark that night. My grandmother went in, started fixing supper, and my papa just sat in his rocking chair with his rifle laid across his lap. I sat in the chair opposite of him. All he did was stare out the window. "Papa, what are we going to do?" He didn't say nothing for a long time. "Son, I don't know, but I won't be run off my farm. We've been here for years. If those damn boys hadn't done what they done, none of this would have happened. Do you think Mr. Lancaster's going to help?" "Son, we don't need his help. I don't know what we need, but it's not that." Just then, my grandmother came in. "Supper's done, boys." So we went and sat at the table. We all ate in silence, which was unusual. We finished our supper, and my grandmother said, "Y'all go wash up and get ready for bed. God knows we could all use a rest." Well, I did as I was told. We got into bed. It was probably 9 o'clock, early. You couldn't hear a sound outside the house, like someone had turned off all the noise. I laid there, it seemed like forever, just staring at the ceiling and kept glancing towards the window. I don't know when it was when I fell asleep, but finally I did. Then, all of a sudden, it sounded like sirens and gunshots, and just the god-awfulest screaming and howling you'd ever heard broke the silence, woke me straight up out of bed. I went tearing off to my grandfather's bedroom. "What is that, Papa? What's going on?" "I don't know, son. Stay down." You could hear bullets impacting the barn and the house and windows breaking. It sounded like war going on. "Papa, why are they shooting? Why are they shooting at our house?" "Son, I don't know." Then all of a sudden this gigantic roar, and all of a sudden something hit the house like a truck. Then you could hear the screams going off in the distance. And then you could hear men running and screaming and still firing off in the distance. Then you heard a knock at the door, a pounding at the door. My grandfather grabbed his rifle, took off, down the stairs and to the front door. He snatched it open, not knowing what to expect, and there were 2 deputies standing there. "Mr. Harold, is everyone all right in here?" "Yes, but what the hell were y'all shooting at, and why were y'all shooting at my house?" "Sir, there were 2 huge creatures at your back door. They looked like they were looking for a way in." One of the deputies yelled, and when he did, it turned, and we don't know what they were. They just started firing in fear. We think we hit one of them. The other one picked up a tire you had laying and threw it like it was a toy. It went through the windshield of my patrol car and out the back. The other deputies chased it out down the back of your field and towards the wood line. They're pursuing it. "You need to stop them. Don't let them go in the woods." "Sir, do not let them go in the woods. There are way more than 2. My grandmother suddenly appeared and said, "I'm calling the sheriff. Ma'am, we've ordered radios for him. He should be here shortly." My grandmother asked the deputies if they wanted to come in. She was fixing to put a pot of coffee on. "No, ma'am, we need to stay out here so we can watch and see what's going on." "Well, okay then, I'll bring you a cup." My grandfather proceeded to out on the porch to sit in his rocking chair. I, myself, stood in the doorway. I was terrified. Not long after that, the sheriff pulled up. He got out of his car, walked up the driveway, and said, "First, is everyone all right?" One of the deputies said, "Sir, yes sir, I believe so. One of our patrol cars got damaged." "Well, as long as no one got hurt, we can fix a patrol car." "Just what exactly happened?" "Well sir, we were making our rounds, and one of the deputies said that he had seen two large figures move up to the back of this farmhouse. When he got there, he saw two large creatures attempting to figure out some way, he said, to get in, is what it looked like. And then one of them turned after he yelled. Then the firing started, sir." "Well, did you hit anything?" "Sir, we believe one got hit, but the other one helped it away, and it went down through the backfield and towards the woodline. We had officers chasing them. Mr. Harold here said that wouldn't be a good idea." "Well, looks like he's right." Just then, you heard one humongous howl. Then you heard several others come in unison. It sounded like the biggest wolf pack you'd ever heard. One of the officers said, "Is that wolves?" My grandfather said, "No, that is them, the boogers." "Sir, what are we going to do? What do you want us? What are your orders?" The sheriff just looked. "Well, I think what we need to do is keep this house right here safe. We need to all converge on this one house, because it seems like for some reason they won't in. I don't know why, but we need to keep these folks here safe." "Yes sir." So all the deputies were called back up to the house. My grandfather and the sheriff went around on the front porch, sit, and my grandmother brought him a cup of coffee. "So, what's your idea, Mr. Harold?" "Huh, I was going to ask you that." "Well, I've been thinking about it. I think we need to get some more help up here, a lot more help. Thought about calling in the National Guard." "I don't think that would be a good idea," my grandpa said, "because they're not from here, they're not going to understand, and then they're going to, when they see these creatures, they're going to start just shooting. Someone is going to get hurt, if not by them, then by them shooting." The sheriff said, "You're right. So what are we going to do?" "Well, why don't we get some of the locals here that we can trust and that actually have some sense, and we go down and see if we can't figure this out." "Okay, tomorrow morning we'll go into town, see if we can't find us some help then." "Yes sir." "So you going to stay here tonight or going to go into town?" "No sir," my grandfather said. "I won't be shut off my farm. We're going to stay right here." "Yes sir, Mr. Harold." "Well, my men and me aren't going anywhere either." "Okay then, sounds like we better put another pot of coffee on." Well, that was one of the longest nights I can tell you of my life. Every once in a while you could hear the crackle of one of the officers' radios come across. "I think I got some ice shine over here." Then it would go away. That went on all night long. It didn't seem like daylight was ever going to come, but finally it did. And the sheriff and my grandpa and me loaded up in the sheriff's car, and we headed to town. We headed to the local diner where a lot of my grandfather's friends and the sheriff's friends and Mr. Bennett, that was still missing, his friends, gathered on the local square. We parked and headed in. My grandfather said, "Sit at the booth up there, son." "Yes sir." And my grandfather and the sheriff walked over to a table where several of the men were sitting. They grabbed chairs, sat down, and started talking. They talked for a long time. Several of the men, I couldn't really hear them, but would shake their heads and then nod their heads yes. And then several of the men got up and walked out. The rest of the men, there were 5 left, got up and followed my grandfather and the sheriff out the door. My grandfather walked by me and said, "Come on, boy." We headed out. We got back to the sheriff's car and said, "All right, y'all go get your guns and head back to Mr. Harold's place. We'll meet you there." So everybody loaded up and headed to the opposite directions to meet back up later at my grandfather's place. We headed back to the farm. On the way there, the ride wasn't quite so talkative. "Well, what's your idea, Mr. Harold?" "Well, I've been thinking. You know, if you got a rogue bear in that area, how you get rid of it?" "Yeah, you burn it out." "Well, why wouldn't that work here?" "Well, just exactly how big of a fire do you want? Well, what if we just set the whole damn valley on fire? The whole valley? Do you realize that's probably over 10 square miles? Well, you got any better ideas? Well, no. But we're going to have to get somebody from the forestry in on this, or they're going to put the damn thing out before it's finished. Yeah. Got any ideas? Well, my brother works for the Forestry Commission. When we get back to your place, I'll give him a call. Sounds good to me. So down the road we went. We finally arrived back home. My grandfather said, "Boy, go back in the house. I don't want you running around out here." One of the deputies ran up to the sheriff. "Sheriff, we have a problem." "What's the problem?" "We found Mr. Bennett." "What do you mean you found Mr. Bennett?" "Well, we found what appears to be Mr. Bennett." "Well, show me what you're talking about." "Yes, sir." So the sheriff's deputy, my grandfather, and the sheriff headed down to the edge of the wood line. I went back in the house. I was told later on, much later on, by my grandfather, what exactly they had saw. My grandfather told me they got down to the edge of the wood line and there were two officers standing about 100 yards in and pointing up in a tree, about 9 feet off the ground. My grandfather said there was the mangled body of one of his best friends, Mr. Bennett, stuck up in the tree like a toy doll. My grandfather said it looked like every bone in his body had been broke and his head was twisted around backwards. "Oh my God," the sheriff said. "What in the hell would do this? Why would it do this?" The sheriff turned around and looked. "Good job, deputy." "Well, sir, it was an accident. We actually found him." "What do you mean an accident?" "Well, we got the idea to go back to the backside of the house to see if we had actually hit anything, looking for blood, hair, you know, the usual." "Yeah. So what'd you find?" "We found some blood, a lot of hair, several crazy footprints. Just unbelievable how big these things are." My grandfather told him, "I told you that, and they're different sizes." "Well, we followed some blood back down this way, and that's when we found him." "Well, still, good job. I told y'all to stay out of these woods." "Well, sir, we kept hearing something back in here." "Well, that's probably one of them," my grandfather said, "and it was probably trying to lure you out here." "Well, we didn't come alone. There were 6 of us. I don't think that's still enough." The sheriff said, "Have y'all called the coroner?" "No, sir, we were waiting on you." "Well, go ahead and call the coroner. Get him out here so we can get him down. And we need to tell his wife." "Yes, sir." So my grandfather said, "I'll go with you." So the sheriff and Mr. Harold, my grandfather, headed towards Mr. Bennett's house. Took them a while to get there, walking up through the woods. They were still talking too. I figured that's what took them so long, trying to figure out exactly what they were going to say. My grandfather said, "Well, I guess the truth is the best." The sheriff said, "Well, I guess so." They arrived at Mr. Bennett's house, and there was muddy footprints all around the barn still, and around the house. It was just like mud had been smeared everywhere, just like kids had done it or something. My grandfather said, "This wasn't like this the other day." The sheriff said, "Yeah, I know, I was over here. Looks like those tracks are fresh too. You know, we didn't think to send anybody back up here last night." They started knocking on Mr. Bennett's door. His wife finally came and answered it. She looked like she hadn't slept in days. Her eyes were bloodshot red, her hair was everywhere, her clothes were a mess. "Miss Bennett, you alright?" No, I'm not. Those damn devils came back like again last night. They towed it off my husband's horse. I don't mean drug it. I mean they picked it up and toted it. I watched them. That's when they started smearing all the mud over the windows so I couldn't see what they were doing, I think. It's these things, what are they? They're from hell. What are we going to do? I'm not staying here anymore. "Ma'am, I have some bad news." "Yes, you found my husband? Is he okay?" "Bad news? What do you mean? Is my husband okay?" "No, ma'am. He's deceased." "Where's he at? I want to see him." "Ma'am, I don't think that's a good idea." We got the coroner coming, and he's going to pick the body up, carry it back to the local morgue. They're going to have to do an autopsy, and then they'll get with you. Oh my Lord, what am I going to do? Do you have somewhere you can stay? I'm going to go to my sister's. I think that'd be the best thing, ma'am. Yes, sir. Then the sheriff and my grandfather turned and walked away. On the way back to my grandfather's house, the sheriff said, "These things toted off a horse? How strong are these things?" My grandfather said, "You've seen what they done to my barn. A tornado has come over this place, and all it did was move the tin, and they tore the back of it out like it was nothing. We're going to have to be extra careful." The sheriff said, "Well, I think your fire idea may be the best bet. If nothing else, maybe it'll just run these damn things out of here if it don't just burn them up and send them back to hell." My grandfather said, "Well, that's the only idea I've come up with." They arrived back at the house. The sheriff got on the phone with his brother. He stayed on there for a good while, then got off and came back to my grandfather and said, "Well, he's on board. If anybody calls in a forest fire, he's going to give it a while before he calls it in for them to come put it out." Well, that's a good idea. He also said for us to come get some drip torches. That way it would be easier for us to set a line of fire. It wouldn't just be going all different directions. Good idea. I'm going to have one of my deputies go get them. Okay. I'd like to do this before it got dark, or we're going to have to wait till tomorrow. I really don't want to do this again all night, sir. We got to get this done today. We'll see. So the sheriff sent his deputy to go get the drip torches from his brother, and the fuel that goes with them too. It was some kind of mixture of kerosene, gasoline, and some other product. Not quite sure how they work. It was around lunchtime when they got everything set and together, and the sheriff got all his men together. The other men from the diner had arrived too. So the sheriff decided to brief everybody exactly what he wanted them to do. The sheriff reminded everybody these things had killed and probably would kill again, so they needed to be extra careful. At least 3 men in a group at all times, and stay in radio contact. And that itself wasn't going to be easy due to the terrain that the men were going into. It was around an hour later when they headed off into the woods. My grandfather told me to take my shotgun and to sit in the living room with my grandmother, and no matter what, not to come outside. Now the rest of the story, I'm going to tell you that my grandfather had to tell me. The sheriff had gotten a map of the area and pointed out where they were going to start at and where they planned on ending the fire line. The fire line was supposed to end at a big creek that went at the back of the valley. They were hoping once the fire had burned out all the vegetation and the wildlife had left, the creatures would leave and retreat back across the creek. So all the men loaded up their weapons, got their drip torches, and headed out. They got to the edge of the wood line, lit the torches, dropped them, and started walking. My grandfather was the head of one of the groups that went to the left of the valley and went off into the wood line. He said as soon as they lit those torches, they hit the ground and started walking, that all the noise in the forest went quiet. He said then you could hear tap, 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 tap on trees. He said they were about 300 yards in, going around about 100 yards away from the edge of the valley when they spotted movement. One of the men said, "Hey, there's somebody over there." My grandfather said, "That's not somebody, that's one of those creatures." "What do?" "We don't do nothing. We keep doing what we're doing. Keep heading towards the creek." "Yes, sir." My grandfather said then they started hearing shots ring out from, he supposed, the other groups. The men said, "What do we do? What do we do?" My grandfather said, "Keep going. Don't stop." All of a sudden the radio came alive. "They're headed towards the creek. They're headed towards the creek." One of the men told my grandfather, "It seems to be working." "Well, it hadn't got really started yet, son." They kept walking on a path that my grandfather was breaking out. It took them almost an hour to reach the creek. Then they turned and started back just a little off of the fire line that they had came down. By then, the fire was taking off, really taking off. My grandfather told him, slow down, slow down. We don't want to set every damn thing on fire. We just want to run it towards the valley. Y'all keep a check behind us. Make sure nothing's coming up behind us, and make sure that fire's not getting away from us. Then the sheriff came over the radio. Mr. Harold, Mr. Harold. Go ahead, Sheriff, this is Mr. Harold. They're headed towards the creek. It seems to be working. I hope so. They were probably 2 hours into their little escapade when all of a sudden a huge log came flying out of the trees and hit one of the men that was with my grandfather and pinned him down. The other 2 men and my grandfather hurried over to help him. All of a sudden the drip torch turned over and the fluid started leaking out. One of the men raced to get it. My grandfather said, leave it. It took all 3 of them to lift the log off the man. He kept saying, I can't feel my legs. I can't feel my legs. My grandfather told him, pick him up. We've got to get him out of here. But what if we paralyze him? Son, if we don't get him out of here, him being paralyzed is the least of our worries. And he is. Just then, a god-awful blood-curdling scream came out of the bottom of the valley. And then it just erupted with noise and just god-awful hollers and yells. Man, what is that? We need to get out of here, my grandfather said. Pick him up, let's move. In all the commotion, the radio, they realized, had been smashed when the man holding it was covered with a log. So now they were cut off from communication with the other parties. My grandfather said he could hear something paralleling them in the woods, just breaking branches and trees. He said it sounded like a bulldozer coming up through there. Then he seen the biggest booger he'd ever seen in his life. He said it had to be over 12 foot tall, 4.5 foot across. It was massive. My grandfather lowered his weapon, told the other men, stay behind me. That thing's gonna kill us. What do you mean stay, but we gotta get out of here. My grandfather said, don't move. He leveled his rifle off right at this creature's chest. And the creature just kind of turned his head like he knew what my grandfather was doing and bared his teeth. My grandfather told him, I don't want to kill you, and I don't think you want to be dead. So why don't you follow the rest of your kind back off in there and let us pass? The creature just stood and looked at him, turning his head back and forth. Then he began to kind of sway. My grandfather said, I'm not going to tell you again. Now either you can move or I can kill you. Doesn't really matter to me because one of y'all killed my best friend for no damn reason. So I figured you got it coming. Now what's it going to be? The creature just kept swaying and looking. My grandfather cocked the hammer on his rifle. And as soon as he done that, the creature turned his head up, screamed, and just leaped back over into where all the fire and everything was going and just took off, my grandfather said. My grandfather hurried up and told the other men, y'all come on, let's get out of here. It didn't quite take one as long to get back as it did to get there. Well, when they finally got back up to where they had started the fire, the other groups, except for one, was there. The one with the sheriff. My grandfather started asking the other people, where's the sheriff? Where's his group? We don't know. We heard a whole bunch of shooting and a bunch of screaming, and that's it. What do you think we should do, Mr. Harold? We've got to go find them. We've got a man hurt here. Carry him up to the house. So they carried the injured man up to the house, and my grandfather and several other of the men went back in the direction where they had last seen the sheriff. On their way back towards the sheriff, my grandfather said they could hear hoots and hollers and howls and screams, even sounded like a couple of times a baby crying, coming from where the valley was, headed back towards the creek. They finally got to an area that was kind of clear, and they could see something laying in the bushes. They couldn't quite tell what it was, so they headed towards it. There, laying in the bushes, was the sheriff. It looked like he'd been in a car wreck. He was barely breathing. My grandfather leaned down and said, Sheriff, you okay? Sheriff. The sheriff, in a muffled voice, said, get me out of here. Get me out of here. So my grandfather and a couple of the men picked him up They started headed back towards the house, with a fire raging behind them and beside them. As they got back to the house, they seen 2 ambulances sitting there. My grandmother had called them for the man that was injured. They quickly brought the sheriff up to one of them, and the EMTs took over. "He's badly hurt, y'all." Then one of the deputies walked up to my grandfather. "What do we do now?" "We don't do nothing now. We sit and we wait." Just then, here come 2 forestry trucks with bulldozers on them pulling up, and the sheriff's brother. He gets out, comes up to my grandfather, then looks over and sees his brother, and he goes over. "What happened?" He couldn't talk, so my grandfather walked over and said, "Son, we got a problem." "Yeah, my brother was telling me some about it. What can we do?" "Is that fire under control?" "I believe so. But won't you take those dozers and go down each side of that valley where our burn line is and cut a fire break, just in case, all the way back to the creek?" So he shook his head okay. He told his men to unload the dozers, and they started cutting fire breaks all the way back to the creek. When the men came back, they kept saying they kept hearing screams and hollers down in the valley. "Were there people down there?" My grandfather said, "No, that's not people. That's those damn creatures we're trying to get rid of." "Well, we kept seeing something go across the creek. We were hoping anything in that valley would leave because of the fire and go across that creek, and hopefully it won't never come back." "Well, if it stays in that valley, it's damn sure not going to live," one of the rangers said. Well, it wasn't long after that that dark started setting in, and that fire burned all night long. It lit the sky up like it was day. The next morning, several of the men, my grandfather, and several of the forest rangers went down into that valley to make sure, supposedly, what the ranger said, there wasn't any hot embers that could start a fire again. My grandfather said there was nothing left in that valley. Nothing. Well, several years have passed. A lot of years have passed since that incident. The man that was with my grandfather that had the log fall on him did make a full recovery, but he does still walk with a limp. The sheriff, on the other hand, never was the same. He left the office early. Then he talked my grandfather into running the next year for sheriff and won. He stayed sheriff for many, many years until he retired. Now I'm glad to say I'm on the sheriff's department as a deputy, hoping one day to follow in my grandfather's footsteps. And yes, every once in a while we get those odd calls, and this story is always in the back of my head. Won't never leave me, but I hope I never ever see one of these creatures again. Well, folks, that's the conclusion to Booger Valley. I hope you've enjoyed it. Sorry it took so long to get it out. Thank you. Good night.